Começarei o projeto amanhã.
I will begin the project tomorrow. I will begin the project tomorrow.
A cerimônia começa às 17 horas.
The ceremony begins at 5 p.m. The ceremony begins at 5 p.m.
Ela começou sua jornada com grande entusiasmo.
She began her journey with great excitement. She began her journey with great excitement.
Ele não sabe por onde começar a explicar a situação.
He doesn't know where to begin explaining the situation. He doesn't know where to begin explaining the situation.
Vamos começar a reunião sem demora.
Let's begin the meeting without delay. Let's begin the meeting without delay.
O professor pediu aos alunos que começassem suas tarefas.
The teacher asked the students to begin their assignments. The teacher asked the students to begin their assignments.
A história começa em uma pequena vila.
The story begins in a small village. The story begins in a small village.
Eles começaram a perceber a importância do trabalho em equipe.
They began to realize the importance of teamwork. They began to realize the importance of teamwork.
Devemos começar a praticar para a competição.
We should begin practicing for the competition. We should begin practicing for the competition.
O livro começa com um mistério intrigante.
The book begins with an intriguing mystery. The book begins with an intriguing mystery.
Quando o concerto começará?
When will the concert begin? When will the concert begin?
Ela começou a escrever seu primeiro romance no ano passado.
She began writing her first novel last year. She began writing her first novel last year.
Ele decidiu começar um novo capítulo em sua vida.
He decided to begin a new chapter in his life. He decided to begin a new chapter in his life.
Eles começaram sua caminhada de manhã cedo.
They began their hike early in the morning. They began their hike early in the morning.
Vamos começar nos apresentando.
Let's begin by introducing ourselves. Let's begin by introducing ourselves.
O filme começa com uma cena dramática.
The movie begins with a dramatic scene. The movie begins with a dramatic scene.
Começaremos quando todos chegarem.
We will begin once everyone arrives. We will begin once everyone arrives.
Ela começou a entender o conceito após a palestra.
She began to understand the concept after the lecture. She began to understand the concept after the lecture.
Ele começou a aprender espanhol no mês passado.
He began learning Spanish last month. He began learning Spanish last month.
A conferência começará em breve.
The conference will begin shortly. The conference will begin shortly.
Onde começamos a planejar o evento?
Where do we begin planning for the event? Where do we begin planning for the event?
Ela começou a preparar o jantar para sua família.
She began cooking dinner for her family. She began cooking dinner for her family.
Ele começou a trabalhar em sua lição de casa assim que chegou em casa.
He began working on his homework as soon as he got home. He began working on his homework as soon as he got home.
A chuva começou a cair levemente.
The rain began to fall lightly. The rain began to fall lightly.
Eles começaram a discutir o assunto durante o almoço.
They began discussing the topic during lunch. They began discussing the topic during lunch.
Devemos começar a apresentação agora.
We should begin the presentation now. We should begin the presentation now.
O festival começa na semana que vem.
The festival begins next week. The festival begins next week.
Ela começou seu treinamento para a maratona.
She began her training for the marathon. She began her training for the marathon.
Ele começou a apreciar as pequenas coisas da vida.
He began to appreciate the little things in life. He began to appreciate the little things in life.
Vamos começar revisando a agenda.
Let's begin by reviewing the agenda. Let's begin by reviewing the agenda.
A história começa com uma carta misteriosa.
The story begins with a mysterious letter. The story begins with a mysterious letter.
Quando você começou a tocar violão?
When did you begin playing the guitar? When did you begin playing the guitar?
Ela começou a pintar como hobby.
She began painting as a hobby. She began painting as a hobby.
Ele começou a economizar dinheiro para as férias dos seus sonhos.
He began saving money for his dream vacation. He began saving money for his dream vacation.
Eles começaram a explorar a floresta juntos.
They began to explore the forest together. They began to explore the forest together.
A música começa suavemente e aumenta gradualmente.
The music begins softly and builds gradually. The music begins softly and builds gradually.
Começaremos a construção no mês que vem.
We will begin construction next month. We will begin construction next month.
Ela começou a se sentir mais confiante sobre suas habilidades.
She began to feel more confident about her skills. She began to feel more confident about her skills.
Ele começou a escrever poesia no ensino médio.
He began writing poetry in high school. He began writing poetry in high school.
A aula começará em 5 minutos.
The class will begin in 5 minutes. The class will begin in 5 minutes.
Por onde devemos começar a limpar esta sala bagunçada?
Where should we begin cleaning this messy room? Where should we begin cleaning this messy room?
Ela começou seu discurso com uma história sincera.
She began her speech with a heartfelt story. She began her speech with a heartfelt story.
Ele começou a organizar suas anotações para a apresentação.
He began organizing his notes for the presentation. He began organizing his notes for the presentation.
Eles começaram a rir da piada engraçada.
They began laughing at the funny joke. They began laughing at the funny joke.
Devemos começar a plantar as sementes antes que escureça.
We should begin planting the seeds before it gets dark. We should begin planting the seeds before it gets dark.
A palestra começou com uma breve introdução.
The lecture began with a brief introduction. The lecture began with a brief introduction.
Ela começou a ver progresso em seus estudos.
She began to see progress in her studies. She began to see progress in her studies.
Ele começou a consertar o motor do carro.
He began repairing the car engine. He began repairing the car engine.
A apresentação começará assim que todos estiverem sentados.
The performance will begin as soon as everyone is seated. The performance will begin as soon as everyone is seated.
Vamos começar revisando as instruções.
Let's begin by going over the instructions. Let's begin by going over the instructions.
A peça começa com uma entrada dramática.
The play begins with a dramatic entrance. The play begins with a dramatic entrance.
Ela começou a ter aulas de fotografia no mês passado.
She began taking photography classes last month. She began taking photography classes last month.
Ele começou a perceber seu verdadeiro potencial.
He began to realize his true potential. He began to realize his true potential.
Eles começaram a fazer um brainstorming de ideias para o novo projeto.
They began brainstorming ideas for the new project. They began brainstorming ideas for the new project.
Começaremos a testar o novo software amanhã.
We will begin testing the new software tomorrow. We will begin testing the new software tomorrow.
O discurso começou com uma citação poderosa.
The speech began with a powerful quote. The speech began with a powerful quote.
Ela começou a cantar assim que a música começou.
She began singing as soon as the music started. She began singing as soon as the music started.
Ele começou a gostar de cozinhar depois de experimentar algumas receitas.
He began to enjoy cooking after trying a few recipes. He began to enjoy cooking after trying a few recipes.
O debate começa em 1 hora.
The debate begins in an hour. The debate begins in an hour.
Onde você acha que devemos começar a resolver esse problema?
Where do you think we should begin fixing this issue? Where do you think we should begin fixing this issue?
Ela começou a ler um novo livro ontem à noite.
She began reading a new book last night. She began reading a new book last night.
Ele começou o dia com uma xícara de café.
He began his day with a cup of coffee. He began his day with a cup of coffee.
Eles começaram a comemorar quando o time marcou um gol.
They began cheering when the team scored a goal. They began cheering when the team scored a goal.
Devemos começar a redigir a proposta em breve.
We should begin drafting the proposal soon. We should begin drafting the proposal soon.
A história começa em um reino mágico.
The story begins in a magical kingdom. The story begins in a magical kingdom.
Ela começou a se preparar para o exame final.
She began preparing for the final exam. She began preparing for the final exam.
Ele começou a se exercitar para melhorar sua saúde.
He began working out to improve his health. He began working out to improve his health.
A construção começa cedo todas as manhãs.
The construction begins early every morning. The construction begins early every morning.
Vamos começar listando todas as tarefas que precisamos fazer.
Let's begin by listing all the tasks we need to do. Let's begin by listing all the tasks we need to do.
O evento começa com um discurso de boas-vindas.
The event begins with a welcome speech. The event begins with a welcome speech.
Ela começou a se sentir melhor depois de descansar um pouco.
She began feeling better after taking some rest. She began feeling better after taking some rest.
Ele começou a escrever seus pensamentos em um diário.
He began to write down his thoughts in a journal. He began to write down his thoughts in a journal.
Eles começaram a decorar o salão para a festa.
They began to decorate the hall for the party. They began to decorate the hall for the party.
A discussão começará depois que todos chegarem.
The discussion will begin after everyone has arrived. The discussion will begin after everyone has arrived.
Ela começou a explorar diferentes opções de carreira.
She began exploring different career options. She began exploring different career options.
Ele começou a praticar seu discurso em frente ao espelho.
He began practicing his speech in front of the mirror. He began practicing his speech in front of the mirror.
O projeto começará assim que os fundos forem aprovados.
The project will begin as soon as the funds are approved. The project will begin as soon as the funds are approved.
Vamos começar resolvendo o problema mais simples primeiro.
Let's begin by solving the simplest problem first. Let's begin by solving the simplest problem first.
O filme começa com uma cena de perseguição emocionante.
The movie begins with a thrilling chase scene. The movie begins with a thrilling chase scene.
Ela começou a entender a importância do autocuidado.
She began to understand the importance of self-care. She began to understand the importance of self-care.
Ele começou a aprender a programar no ano passado.
He began learning how to code last year. He began learning how to code last year.
A contagem regressiva começa à meia-noite.
The countdown begins at midnight. The countdown begins at midnight.
Devemos começar a escrever o relatório hoje.
We should begin writing the report today. We should begin writing the report today.
A história começa com o estranho misterioso.
The story begins with a mysterious stranger. The story begins with a mysterious stranger.
Ela começou a tricotar um cachecol para sua amiga.
She began knitting a scarf for her friend. She began knitting a scarf for her friend.
Ele começou a ficar nervoso antes da entrevista.
He began to feel nervous before the interview. He began to feel nervous before the interview.
O processo começa com uma análise detalhada.
The process begins with a detailed analysis. The process begins with a detailed analysis.
Vamos começar com um exercício de aquecimento.
Let's begin with a warm-up exercise. Let's begin with a warm-up exercise.
A música começa a tocar suavemente ao fundo.
The music begins to play softly in the background. The music begins to play softly in the background.
Ela começou a organizar seu armário no fim de semana.
She began organizing her closet over the weekend. She began organizing her closet over the weekend.
Ele começou a esboçar ideias para sua nova pintura.
He began sketching ideas for his new painting. He began sketching ideas for his new painting.
O programa começa às 10 horas em ponto.
The program begins at 10 a.m. sharp. The program begins at 10 a.m. sharp.
Onde você acha que devemos começar nossa pesquisa?
Where do you think we should begin our research? Where do you think we should begin our research?
Ela começou a reconhecer a beleza nas coisas simples.
She began to recognize the beauty in simple things. She began to recognize the beauty in simple things.
Ele começou a construir o modelo de avião.
He began constructing the model airplane. He began constructing the model airplane.
A reunião começará depois que todos assinarem.
The meeting will begin after everyone signs in. The meeting will begin after everyone signs in.
Vamos começar abordando as questões mais urgentes.
Let's begin by addressing the most pressing issues. Let's begin by addressing the most pressing issues.
A lição começa com um fato interessante.
The lesson begins with an interesting fact. The lesson begins with an interesting fact.
Ela começou a ser voluntária em um abrigo local.
She began volunteering at a local shelter. She began volunteering at a local shelter.
Ele começou a planejar sua viagem com meses de antecedência.
He began planning his trip months in advance. He began planning his trip months in advance.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes to keep improving your English. And remember, listening, practice, and improve.